If I told you about a Vietnamese army, outnumbered 5-1, that completely annihilated a powerful Ming invasion force without a single direct confrontation, would you believe me? It wasn't sturdy walls or advanced weaponry, but a chilling silence, an oppressive darkness, and deserted villages so desolate that even the cats and dogs had fled. This is the largely untold story of a miraculous military strategy known as the Empty Fortress Plan, which lured a massive army to its doom. In 1427, in northern Vietnam, after over a decade of arduous and tenacious fighting against the Ming invasion, when victory seemed within grasp, the sky suddenly darkened once more. From the mountainous regions of southern China, two powerful Ming armies thundered southward. One army, led by the veteran General Liang Sheng, traversed the treacherous passes of Guangxi, commanding over 100,000 elite troops. The other, under the command of General Mu Thang, advanced from Yunnan, poised to strike from the west. Their aim was to crush the Vietnamese will, break the siege at Zhuangjiang, a Ming stronghold desperately resisting, and return Dai Viet to the brutal rule of the empire. Faced with this situation, despair was widespread. Hope seemed lost. But then something extraordinary happened. As Liang Sheng's army entered Vietnamese territory, they encountered no resistance whatsoever. Not a single soldier, not a scout, only a terrifying silence. Villages were deserted, rice paddies lay unharvested, bridges unguarded, roads eerily clear. Everything was too easy, too convenient. And that was precisely what Loloy, the leader of the Lam Sun Rebellion, wanted them to believe. This wasn't negligence, it was a trap, a deadly snare, a cunning stratagem that still inspires awe. Loloy and his brilliant generals, Nguyen Trãi, Tran Nguyen Han, Tran Nguyen Thich, Nguyen Zai, Luan Gan, Luan Han Chu, and others, had meticulously studied the terrain and understood the enemy's psychology. They knew the Ming commanders were arrogant and overconfident, believing the Vietnamese would be terrified, crumble, and rush into a head-on confrontation. Therefore, instead of direct engagement, they vanished, creating an illusion of absolute Ming dominance, luring them deep into treacherous mountainous terrain, stretching their supply lines and completely severing communication with their rear. And as the Ming army advanced deeper, the deadly trap sprung shut. At the center of it all was Loloy, the leader of the Lam Sun Uprising. To the enemy, he was a rebel. To his people, he was hope. For 10 years, he'd led peasants, blacksmiths, monks, and the impoverished, forging them into a battle-hardened elite army, moving as swiftly as smoke, striking as fiercely as thunder. But Loloy wasn't alone. By his side was Nguyen Trãi, whose most potent weapon wasn't a sword but words. A brilliant military strategist, an accomplished scholar, and a gifted poet, he wrote letters urging enemy generals to surrender, deploying incisive propaganda that turned Ming soldiers against their own army. He created psychological traps so precise they worked even before a single arrow was loosed. Then there were the valiant generals, Tran Nguyen Han, Tran Nguyen Thich, and Nguyen Zai, unyielding heroes who led their armies through every peril, bringing victory to their nation. Luan Han Chu, the sword in the shadows, a master of ambush tactics, constantly monitored enemy movements. Lalai and Lalu, two brave young warriors, were entrusted with difficult, dangerous missions that no one else dared to undertake. Together, they accomplished the seemingly impossible, letting the Ming army walk right in, guiding them step by step into the theater of death without their knowledge. Let's talk about that trap. As Liang Sheng's army entered Vietnam, they encountered only emptiness, no resistance, no sound, only winding paths through dense jungles, towering mountains, deserted villages, and people vanished without a trace. It was a masterful deception. The Vietnamese had emptied the villages ahead of the Ming, leaving behind signs of panic, destroyed carts, scattered rice, abandoned meals. They made the Ming feel overly confident, believing they had secured victory and were in complete control. But behind those verdant hills, thousands of Vietnamese soldiers moved silently, blocking paths, severing supply lines, setting up ambushes everywhere. Step by step, the enemy was lured into the death trap. And just as Liang Sheng thought he was on the verge of victory, he was surrounded on all sides. The terrifying thing was that the Ming army didn't even realize they were being hunted. They pressed forward, mocking the Vietnamese weakness, believing they wouldn't dare to engage in direct combat. But then some scouts began to disappear without a trace. The terrain started to change. The valleys narrowed, the jungle closed in. The paths became slippery due to sudden, almost unnatural downpours. When the Ming's first supply line was cut, whispers of doubt began to surface, but it was too late. The death trap had sprung shut. He entered the valley as a brilliant general, but he would never leave. The moment had arrived. Kai Lang Valley, a place seemingly peaceful, silent, even beautiful. But to the Vietnamese, it was a razor-sharp blade sculpted by mountains, honed by a river, concealed within an ethereal fog, and the enemy was walking right into it. On October 10, 1427, Liang Sheng led his army deeper into Kai Lang. Over 30,000 soldiers, fully armed, confident, arrogant, drums beating, banners flying, with no inkling of the death that awaited them. Suddenly, the vanguard halted. The path narrowed. Dense bamboo forest lined both sides. Ahead, only a shallow stream glistened under a gray sky. It looked peaceful, too peaceful. Then a scream, an arrow, then dozens, hundreds of arrows from the trees, from the rocks, from the mist. The Vietnamese unleashed a hellish rain of arrows. This wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Liang Sheng's army was spread out, trapped on narrow paths. Heavy cavalry couldn't maneuver. Rear units couldn't advance. They were stuck in the death trap, and the jungle exploded. Loloi's soldiers attacked with perfect timing. From above, from behind, from the flanks, spears, rockets, fire, sharpened bamboo stakes hidden in the mud, the Ming stumbled, screamed, and disappeared into the now blood-red water. Amid the chaos, Liang Sheng was still alive. He roared, trying to rally his troops, ordering his elite guard to break through the encirclement, and the Vietnamese led him on. They opened a gap just wide enough. He charged straight into another trap. From atop a hill, Loloi waited. As Liang Sheng entered the open area, the order was given. In seconds, he was wounded. His horse fell. He fell, trying to rise, but too late. A single blow, and the head of the powerful general rolled into the mud of Kai Lang. Silence, then panic. The Ming army, leaderless, crumbled. Tens of thousands fled. Many didn't survive. Others discarded their weapons and begged for mercy. And the Vietnamese, they didn't pursue. They simply stood there, letting the silence speak. But the war wasn't over, because in the distance, Mu Thang's army was still marching, and another trap awaited them. By the time they arrived, the war was over for them. When news of Liang Sheng's death reached the Second Ming Army under General Mu Thang, it was like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. He hesitated, recalculated, but it was too late. His army, tens of thousands strong, had advanced deep into Vietnamese territory. Supplies were dwindling, maps were unreliable, villages were deserted, and the jungle watched and waited. Mu Thang had planned with Liang Sheng to break the siege at Zhuangjiang and claim a glorious victory. Instead, he found only silence, and behind that silence, the cold gaze of the Vietnamese. The attacks didn't happen all at once. They were slow, deliberate, methodical. Snipers in trees, sharpened stakes in the riverbed, ambushes disguised as retreats. The Vietnamese weren't just fighting, they were gradually dismantling the Ming from within. Worse, Nguyen Tri struck again. Letters were slipped into Ming camps, beautiful, poetic, but also devastating. They told of Liang Sheng's death, of the choice to surrender, of Vietnamese mercy. Some Ming officers believed it. They deserted. Some disobeyed orders, others froze, terrified. And around them, the jungle continued to close in, tightening the noose. Then came the final blow. When Muzang finally reached Zhuangjiang, it was surrounded. Because the Vietnamese had taken it by tunnel, by sabotage, and a night attack that ended in chaos. The Ming's last hope vanished. And then the message came, surrender or die. Muzang surrendered. Tens of thousands of Ming soldiers knelt, not because they were weak, but because they had been strategically defeated, outmaneuvered, overcome by a tenacious, unyielding nation, a people who refused to be ruled. But now what? Would the Ming emperor send more troops, or finally yield to the will of a free nation? The victory had ended the war, but it opened up something far greater. After Muzang's surrender, after silence returned to the valleys, after the last sword was sheathed, Dai Viet stood firm. No more tribute, no more occupation, no more foreign banners on Vietnamese walls. The Ming, humiliated, officially recognized Dai Viet's independence. They called it a strategic retreat. But history remembers what it truly was: a crushing defeat, an unwashable stain. But for the Vietnamese people, the pain ran deeper. 20 years of war, homes burned, villages ravaged, generations lost in the fires of conflict. And yet something stronger remained: memory, ingenuity, national identity. The victory at Zhuangjiang wasn't just a military triumph. It was proof that intellect could defeat empires, that freedom could outlast armies, that silence could be louder than cannons. It was strategy over strength, intellect over brawn, patience over pride and heroes. Loloy became emperor, but he never forgot the hills that sheltered him, nor the friends who fell in the forest. Nguyen Trai penned a proclamation so powerful it still resonates today. The Bin Ngo Dai Cao, a Vietnamese declaration of independence written centuries before the world's most famous ones. And across the land, stone tablets, temples, and folk songs still whisper their names. Even now, Kai Lang remains quiet. The mountains stand like silent sentinels, witnessing the ebb and flow of history. Rice paddies bloom where blood once soaked the earth. But if you stand still long enough, you can feel it, the weight of memory, the breath of a nation that once whispered into the mist, "Come, we will wait." Some victories echo for centuries. Some stories refuse to be buried. The dust has long settled on Kai Lang. No more steel, no more blood, only wind. But what happened there wasn't just about a battle or a war. It was about a people who refused to disappear. It was about the belief that homeland is worth any price, even when outnumbered, when no one believes in you, when the world forgets your name. History speaks of emperors, armies, conquests, but it belongs to the nameless ones, the villagers who burned their homes so the enemy couldn't use them, the farmers who became scouts, the mothers who carried messages in their clothes, the children who knew every trail on the hills. They're not in textbooks, but they were the battlefield. And now, what does a 15th century jungle war mean to us today? We live in comfortable screens and noise, but the world still demands the same things: courage, clarity, unshakable belief. Not with swords, but with truth, with memory, with the refusal to forget. Because every generation has its own Kai Lang, a test, a silence before the storm, a choice. You can run, you can surrender, or you can stand, fight fiercely, and defend your country. So I ask you, when your Kai Lang comes, will you be ready? But even now, can you truly say you've heard it all? Because history never tells everything. There are still letters in the earth, skeletons beneath rice paddies, whispers in bamboo forests, and wounds never recorded in textbooks. So I leave you with this. Is that really the whole story? Or is there more buried beneath the silence?